Hello, friends. Welcome to Brewing Thought. We are doing a playlist on integration between Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations using Azure Logicapps. In this video, we will use the DMF Package API Export pattern to export data out of Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. We will go through the understanding of what the package API export process is, and then we will configure the same in Logic App from scratch. So let's begin. Understand the DMF package API export process, we have to understand the concepts of data management, export import framework, as well as the HTTP calls which we have to do when calling a package API. Now, this is documented on Microsoft Docs, where the concept of package API is explained. There is also one more pattern which is called recurring integration API, which we will cover in our upcoming sessions. Now, in order to export the data using package API, we basically have to do some REST API calls to finance and operation. The first one we have to do is export to package. And in this call, we have to pass the project ID as an input. Now, what finance and operation does is it returns an execution ID in response. Now, this execution ID is unique for each export process. Now, we will call another REST API to check the status of that export using the execution ID. And once we get a successful response, we will do a third HTTP call to finance and operation to get the URL of where Dynamics has actually exported that file. So this blob URL is a part of your standard finance and operations license. It's not something which you can configure in your Azure portal as a storage, but this comes as a part of finance and operations offering. So finance and operations automatically exports the zip file to a blob storage. And as a part of the response of this API call, you get a secured URL, which is having the security information embedded inside it. And using that URL, you can download the file from the blob storage. Now, how these calls look like is very well documented on this page. So if we look at export to package API, so this is how the API looks. So let's start configuring this in Logic Apps. What I have done is to give us a jump start, I have created a Logic app in advance with a basic structure where I have just initialized the variables which we will need to configure the HTTP call. So the variables we have initialized are the audience, which is basically the root URL of your finance and operations environment, the tenant ID where your environment is hosted. In this case, it's hosted in my private tenant. And this is a demo environment with standard demo database. Then I have a client ID and secret, which I have configured in finance and operation to authenticate my call. So these are just few variables which we have predefined in this particular Logic app. A quick setup on finance and operations side. So in the data management framework, we have configured a data export project, which is exporting the data from the entity customer groups. At the moment in this environment, we have created a couple of customer groups, which we are expecting to see in the exported file. So let's start with our first call. So the first call for us is to trigger the export to package. So what we do is we just copy this from here and we go back to our Logic app and we add a step. Now, what you will notice is, and if you have watched my previous videos, we are only using very few operations, and these are actually giving us all the capabilities we need to interact with finance and operations. So I will first make a standard HTTP call, and this is a post call. So you can see here it's a post call. So we will use a post method here, and in the URI, we have the audience followed by the call. So I'll just rename it to export to package just to have a better readability of the logic app. Now in the body, we have to pass a small JSON payload where we will mention that the definition group ID, which is basically the name of your export project, and legal entity, the execution ID, which is blank in this case at the moment. Now this will basically trigger an export. If we save and run this logic app, let's see. And we also have to read the response to extract the execution ID. So let's run this logic app and see if we can get a response, and then we will basically parse the response to get the uh, authentication failed as always. So what I'll do is I'll go back to my logic app, and we will also define the authentication. Tenant, audience, client, and the secret. So let's save this logic app and let's run it so that when we get the response, we can parse that response and extract the execution ID. In the meantime, if we look at the data project and if we look at the history, we should see that a new data export project has been triggered. So here you can see the latest one is at 11:08. And if we go back to the logic app, we have successfully called this API, and the response is having that execution ID. So what we need to do is basically now copy this response, and we will parse this response to extract the execution ID. So in order to do that, we will add a new step where we will now parse the JSON. Sorry, I selected the wrong one. So we use data operations, parse JSON, and here we will use sample payload, which is this. And the input to this is the body of my export to package. Now, this will basically parse the JSON and extract the information. And let's add a new step to initialize a variable, which is our execution ID. We will rename initialize variable execution ID, which is of type string. And here the value is basically the value of my parse JSON. So this will give me back an execution ID. So let's save it and let's run it to see if it's all working fine. In the meantime, let's go back to finance and operations and refresh. We can see a new export has triggered and it has already ended. So we can see it's quite fast. So if you go inside this, we can see it took literally around 4 seconds to export these number of records. And if we go here, our logic app has also successfully executed, and we have got the value in our execution ID variable. So let's take a pause and see where we are in this whole process. So we have done our first HTTP call to export the package, and we have extracted the execution ID. Now the next step for us is to basically check the execution summary status. Now, in real world, you can have some timer and a while loop to check while till the execution status is succeeded, you move to next step. But just to keep things simple in this video, I will add a timer and then we will add the call to check the status so that we are pretty confident in this case that the call will be successful. So let's add a delay of let's say 30 seconds. And then we add a new call, which is an HTTP operation. And in this case, we want to call the get execution summary status one. So what we'll do is I'll just copy the URI, which is basically your root URL followed by this particular syntax here. And then in the body, we have to pass the execution ID here. So what we do is in the body, we pass the execution ID, and the execution ID is basically now stored in our variable here. So this is how we have passed the output from the previous step in the body of this particular step. And let's add the authentication method. Type OData, sorry, OAuth, and we enter the tenant ID, audience, client ID, and secret. So now we have got the execution status summary. Now, what we need to do is once it's successful, we have to do our third call. Now, the third call is basically a call to get the URL of the exported file. And in this case, also, we have to pass the execution ID. So if we look at get exported package URL, this is the get exported package URL API, where you can see it is a post call. And this is basically the URL which we have to call after our root base address. And then this is the body, which is same as which we used in the previous step. So let's add this new step here as HTTP action, which is post, and we use the get exported package URL call here. Now in this, we have to pass the execution ID. So what we can do is we can basically copy paste the body from our previous call. And then we can add a parameter for our authentication. We define the tenant, URL of FNO, client ID, and secret. Cool, let's save it. So let's take a pause and see what we have done. We have done 3 HTTP calls till now, which is basically to export the package from Dynamics, get its status, and get the package URL. Now what we have to do is let's run this and see the response of this get exported package URL call, because from this we have to extract the URL where our package is stored. And so let's run it. We'll go back to Dynamics and let's look at the data project. We can see it's executing. The job ID is the one with timestamp of 11:15 a.m. So we can see that we have added a delay just to make sure that the package is properly exported. And here we can see the package has ended. And while we are waiting here, we'll just give it a few more seconds to complete this delay. Probably in real time, you can check after every 5 seconds to see if it's completed or not. So let's see the responses. So get execution summary status, where we passed the execution ID, has an output status code 200, which said value is succeeded. So we can use this value in our conditions to check if the export was successful or not. If the export is successful, we get the URL. Now in this call, we passed the execution ID, and the output is basically this value. If we expand it, here we can see that this URL is basically quite long because it has some security context embedded into it. So what we need to do is we need to parse this response and extract the URL, which we will use to download the file. So let's go back to our designer. And in order to get the URL from the response, we will use our parse JSON data operation. We say parse JSON, and here in the sample payload, we will paste the response from the previous output. output, and here in the content, we will pass the body of the get exported package URL. So this way we are extracting the parse JSON extract URL. And then what we do is basically this value will be used to download the file. Now to download the file, we basically have to just do a HTTP GET call to the URI. So here this is, we will be able to see the value here. So we just have to do a GET call. Now in this particular call, we do not need to embed any security information because this URL is already having the security credentials embedded into it. So we can say get file. Now the response of this is basically a stream of that zip file. So what we need to do is we need to store it somewhere. So for that, what I have done is I have created a Azure Blob container. At the moment, it is empty here, as you can see, which is in the blob storage we created in our previous videos when we were doing the import process. So we will use this storage location as our destination. So whatever we have extracted from the finance and operation blob storage, we will push it here. So let's add a new step, which is of Azure Blob Storage. And here we will create a blob storage. So we will select that action. In my previous video, I showed how we can create a new connection. So I'm using that same connection in this video. So we will use the blob storage. And in this time, I will store it in the outbound. And in the blob name, what I can do is I can basically use the name which I want to do. So maybe I can use UTC now as an expression, and then I will create a zip file out of it. So whatever is the current date time becomes the name of the file. And the content of the file is basically the output of my HTTP GET. So if I do here and I do body, this becomes my content. So now at this stage, it looks, this will basically create a zip file in my blob storage. So let's save this and let's run this logic app. Let's go to Dynamics and check the job history. Here we can see a new package export has been initiated with the execution ID of 1120.03. And in the logic app, while we are waiting, we can validate that the execution ID we have got is the same which we just saw here. So let's refresh. So it has ended successfully from Dynamics. And if we go here, we are almost done with our wait. So it should proceed further. And yep, all green. We like seeing green buttons. So get execution summary status is showing the output of succeeded. Get exported package URL is giving us an output of the blob storage path. We are able to extract the URL from here. And in the get file, you can see we have actually passed that complete URL, which we wanted to use to download the file. And in the create blob storage, we can see that a file with this name has been created. So if I go to my blob storage and I refresh, we can see there is a file, there's a zip file which we were expecting. And if we download this zip file, let's have a look at the content. So I've downloaded this zip file, and when we open it, just waiting for system to respond. Yeah. So now we have opened this zip file. What we can see here is that there is a CSV file inside the folder. These are the definition files, but let's have a look at the CSV file. And here we can see we have all the data from the customer groups, which we were expecting in the file. So this is how you can basically download a zip file from a package API using Logicapps from finance and operations. Now, in real time, what you can do is you can have another logic app which is listening to this outbound folder, and then it can extract the contents and then push it to your target systems. But the idea of using logic apps in this video was to showcase how we can actually initiate and extract and create a zip file in your own blob storages. So just to summarize, four HTTP REST APIs back to back. First one is to trigger the export. Second one is to get the summary status. Third one is to get the package URL. Fourth one is to get the actual file. And then we are able to create a zip file in our blob storage using that response. So that's it, folks, for this video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned because we will be covering recurring APIs in our upcoming videos. See you. Bye.